Our panelists are Susan Athey, the Economics of Technology professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Jim Fishkin, the James M. Peck Chair of International Communication and Professor of Communication and of Political Science by courtesy and Director of the Center for Deliberative Democracy, and Ashish Goel, Professor of Management Science and Engineering and by courtesy of Computer Science. We'll start with a presentation from Susan Athey, and as we get her slides up, I'll give you a longer introduction of Susan. Susan Athey is the Economics of Technology professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. She received her bachelor's degree from Duke University and her PhD from Stanford, and she holds an honorary doctorate from Duke University. She previously taught at the economics departments at MIT, Stanford, and Harvard. In 2007, Professor Athey received the John Bates Clark Medal awarded by the American Economic Association to that American economist under the age of 40 who is adjudged to have made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. She was elected to the National Academy of Science in 2012 and to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2008. Professor Athey's research focuses on the economics of the internet, online advertising, the news media, marketplace design, virtual currencies, and the intersection of computer science, machine learning, and economics. She advises governments and businesses on marketplace design and platform economics, notably serving since 2007 as a long-term consultant to Microsoft Corporation in a variety of roles, including consulting chief economist.
Thanks so much. It's great to see everyone today. So today I want to talk about some research that I have been working on for a number of years about how people get their information online. And I got started working on this when I was consulting for the Bing search engine. And one of the things that at the time I felt few people appreciated, but I think now is becoming more and more understood, is that the way that you present information to users online has a huge impact on what they do and what they read. So in some sense, like the whole point, all of the billions of dollars of R&D behind Google search engine, Bing search engine, Amazon's R&D on their user interface is all about getting things in the right order. And the reason that's important is because the order in which you present things has a huge impact on what they do. Much more important than like the price or anything else is just what information you give people. And what you realize is that when you start controlling a user interface and experimenting with it and seeing the impact, you realize that that's going to affect people's decisions and information across everything that they do. So I was working for Bing on sort of more of the commercial side, but then I was able to Microsoft Research, get access to data about internet browsing behavior, which allowed me to study from a more scientific perspective how people get news. So that's what I'm going to tell you about today. So I'm going to focus on sort of two aspects of the changing online media landscape. One of them is news aggregators, and you can think of like Google News is the one I'm going to study because that was easier to study. But there's the Huffington Post, other types of intermediaries that might some of them produce some of their own news, but a lot of them bring together content from other places. And so Google News in particular has been in the crosshairs of public policy because they will bring in only content from news media sites. They don't pay for that content. And about half the people who visit the Google News homepage won't click through and visit the media website. So in some sense, the Google News homepage looks a lot like the New York Times homepage, except for they don't hire any reporters. And so this was very controversial in the news industry, and pretty much every country in the world has had some sort of policy investigation into these news aggregators. And so I'm going to use a natural experiment that occurred as a result of one of these policy interventions to try to understand what is the impact of these intermediaries in terms of what people read and how they read. And in particular, this is going to be important because we want to understand, are these sort of new business models, if you like, of people who are kind of aggregating stuff and not creating it, are they substitutes or complements for the existing media? Do they help people find stuff, or do they actually just steal their readers? And then the second part, I'm going to look at social media and what the impact of Facebook and Twitter are on what people read. All of this is going to be sort of from the user perspective, not from the perspective of a particular publisher. And so, of course, we see over time that in between, that people are less and less going directly to news outlets as their curators of news. And so we want to understand, ultimately, what is the impact on the news that's created of these changes in user consumption. So I got started on this research project. Really, I've been thinking a lot about the news media, but I spoke at this conference. It was a really exciting conference where Rupert Murdoch and Arianna Huffington were kind of duking it out. So by the time they had talked, of course, nobody was interested in what I had to say. But anyways, it kept a lot of fireworks going. And they were basically arguing about two different theories of news aggregators. So Rupert Murdoch says, aggregators substitute for the visits to the website. And he basically articulates a very coherent economic theory, which is that there's no free news story. If people don't come and see our ads, then we have no incentive to create the news. And so if someone else can show that same content without having to do the work, that's going to diminish our incentives, and ultimately that's going to lead to less news. So that was his argument, which, not to say that I agree with him on everything, but it's a very well-articulated, coherent economic argument, and it's the same type of thing that comes up with general intellectual property. In some sense, what's kind of amazing, actually, is that we have any news at all in the United States, really. If you think about it, because, if you invent a drug, if you do R&D, you get a patent that protects you. And then you can get the profit from it. But in news, you can pretty much copy news right away. And so but in that environment, this has long been settled as a matter of policy that because of freedom of speech, we're not going to give intellectual property protections to news. In the old world, you had to print out the paper, so you had a day of intellectual property protection, and that gave you an incentive. Plus, you had sort of a local monopoly over your local advertisers, and so you actually could profit really well from your news. In fact, when the FTC got involved with news in the old days, it was because they were exerting monopoly power over their local advertisers, and they were too profitable. In an environment where you can digitally copy news, basically your intellectual property is a second. And so it is actually it's a real fundamental problem of whether we're going to be able to sustain this investment. Arianna Huffington basically says, well, aggregators are like taxis. They drive people to the newspaper, and actually somebody from Google also spoke here, and he said, well, look, we help people find stuff. That's what we do. And so we're going to be a complement. We're going to help people read more stuff. And here the economic theory is basically that, well, if it's easier for you to find stuff, you'll read more of it. And so even if some people don't click through from Google News, the extra reading will be good for the news industry. You're going to reduce search costs. And of course, both of these are coherent stories. It's just a matter of magnitudes, which is why we need to measure it. And so what happened in Spain, actually, a lot of Europe, people were criticizing the aggregators. And so Spain actually passed a law and said, hey, if you want to put up, in response to lobbying from the news industry, hey, if you want to put up our content, you've got to pay the news industry. Basically, the next day, Google News in Spain shut down. So now we're going to study what did that do. Well, in the news media, actually, there was initially some discussion that there was a big impact of this. But it turns out, I'm going to show you that this is really a little bit misleading. So here's a time series of aggregate news from Spain from a sample of 160,000 users. And so we see that right after this news shutdown, indeed news declines. But then you take a look and say, oh my goodness, this is Christmas. And actually, news reading was declining prior to the shutdown. So I can't just use a simple before and after to study this. Now, a second problem is that while the news outlets kind of kept track of how important Google was, this is direct navigation, people coming directly from navigating. This is coming from search. This is coming from Google News. This is coming from social and other sources. These are all the different ways you can arrive at a newspaper. Turns out Google search was very important, and this is blue is other search engines. Red is the Google search engine. Google News was actually very unimportant. It just wasn't that popular in Spain. And so all they shut down was Google News. Now, they might have also chosen to pull news out of Google search, but they did not. So the impact was actually pretty small in aggregate. So it's clear that, on aggregate statistics, that effect won't really even be big enough to measure. So what we did instead is we isolated only people who had been reading Google News. So we took the people who accounted for that small group, and then we're going to look at the effect of the shutdown on them. And in some sense, the shutdown is not going to have any effect on people who never went there, so pulling them out is not a problem. It is, though, going to mean that my population is a different population. This is not an average person. This is an average person who used Google News. And then we're going to match them up with people who are basically identical to them in terms of news browsing and in terms of overall internet activity. And so for every treatment user that is a Google News user, we're going to match them up with a control user who was browsing the web the same amount as them and use them as a control. And to see how well we did, you can look at the time patterns before. So the red is the Google News, the blue is the control. And for the many weeks before the shutdown, our users look almost exactly the same. Their weekend patterns, it's all pretty similar. But then after the Google News shutdown, they break apart. And what happens is the Google News users use less news. Okay, and so that's a substantial change. It's about a 16% reduction in news consumption for the Google News users. So it's like you're saying, okay, you took away your favorite news source and now you're going to read less news. So then we can say, well, what's the impact on different types of outlets? So there's 3 different kinds of outlets. We look at the top 5 outlets in Spain, the middle 15, and the ones that are ranked lower than 20 in size. And we can look at what happens to the causal effect, using this group as a control group, on their news consumption from shutting down Google News. And so what we see is for the top 5 outlets, they actually get more page views. So that when we take away Google News, people substitute to other top outlets. So the top outlets, like the Wall Street Journal, complaining that Google News steals their users, is borne out in the data. They do. And so if you believe that you would like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on to have more reporters investing in news, then you might think Google News is bad for them. And it's bad, therefore, for the amount of investigative journalism we get from top websites. On the other hand, if you look at the very bottom, there's a negative 10% effect. So the small news outlets lose traffic when Google News goes away. So for small outlets, you're not going to bookmark them. You don't really know about them. The search costs are high. It's more expensive for you to go look than your expected benefit. So you don't go. So Google News helps you find the small outlets. If you think the small outlets are mostly copying the big outlets, you might think that it's good that the Google News is going away is actually a good thing because they were just copying. They weren't actually doing R&D. If you think that the small outlets are providing a diverse perspective, that they are giving media diversity, if you think these small outlets are doing a social service, then Google News going away would be bad. And I did not yet measure that. That would take a lot more work. Then we looked at the number of distinct outlets, and we saw Google News going away really makes you much more loyal. So if you're a newspaper, you want people to be loyal, because then you get to know them and you can monetize them better. People are much less loyal when they use aggregators. And we also find that from Facebook and so on. You just go to all sorts of outlets when you go from social media or aggregators. Then we looked at, well, why and how, what kinds of things were they reading less? And we broke apart, tested a bunch of different hypotheses. The strongest one was I'll tell you about here. So essentially, this is a kind of a complicated graph, but what we tried to understand was what kinds of news people were reading in 2 dimensions. One is the hours since publication. So we look at the first time a news topic appears on the web, and we look at the hours since publication. I should mention, in order to do this, this is part of where the kind of background machine learning comes in. We need to look at all the different articles people read, and they're in Spanish, which I don't even speak Spanish very well, but we used a machine learning algorithm to put articles into topics. So we would notice that all these different articles were about, a problem, Princess Christina corruption, or some other type of world event, Ebola, something else that was going on. So we would put all of those into topic, and then we could say, when was the first article on the topic appearing? So this is hours since publication. These are recent and these are non-recent. The second thing we did was, in a user-specific way, we looked at a user and said, what are your favorite outlets? And then we looked at topics that were undercovered on your favorite outlets. So if you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, then say the Benghazi scandal is going to be undercovered on those. Whereas on Fox, say the Benghazi is going to be overcovered on Fox. So that topic, some certain topics are covered more and less by different outlets. So we're going to call an article scarce for a user if that user can't find this topic very well on their favorite outlets. And so then what we said was, we're going to predict if Google News went away and they didn't substitute, how much reduction in news would they have? And so these bars are going to be how much loss they got in news consumption. And the red is going to be scarce and the blue is non-scarce. So for example, I'm going to see that very recent news, if you didn't try to substitute, very recent news that is very scarce is going to have almost an 80% reduction in readership, because the only place people were getting that was from Google News. So the light bars is what we predicted if they didn't substitute at all, and the dark bars is what actually happened. And so basically, for these very scarce, very recent news stories that just broke, the Google News users did not find a substitute. And so what actually happened is what we would predict happened if they took Google News away and didn't go anywhere else. Where for the non-scarce, older news, what actually happened, the dark bar, is different than that, which basically means they substituted. There wasn't actually much reduction in news. So older news that's well covered on their favorite news outlets, they find a replacement for. But fresh news that's not well covered on their favorite outlets, they just never read about it. So it's really showing that this is kind of the role of Google News. If you're in a news outlet, you might think this is their unfair advantage. You have to actually go send a reporter to write the story, which might take you 5 hours, while Google News, the first time it appears anywhere on the web, boom, it's on their website. They can identify very quickly using data from search that it's important and get it up really fast. So from a consumer perspective, it's great holding fixed the supply of news, but maybe it's going to, in equilibrium, in the long term, it might diminish investment. Okay, so this is basically some of the idea of what these aggregators do from the perspective of users and from the perspective of the news outlets. Now I'll just say a few words about another study we did looking at the effect of social media and Facebook and Twitter. Here we don't have a natural experiment, and so I don't have as clean a causal effect. So before I said Google News causes X or causes Y. That's because something changed, and I had a control group. It was the synthetic control group, so there's some caveats. It's not as clean as a randomized experiment. But I was basically making a claim that Google News causes you to read some things. Now I'm just going to show you kind of correlations. I'm going to show you when you go from Facebook to read news, what do you do differently than if you go from the New York Times to read news? That's the comparison I'm going to make. But I don't have as an experiment to use. And so my questions, I want to see whether people are going to consume different kinds of news when they come from Facebook. Is it going to be more or less biased? And are the articles going to be written differently? And so in order to do this, again, in the background, I have to do a bunch of machine learning. I need to take my articles and put them into topics. And then I want to find out some pretty subtle characteristics of the articles. And so my methodology is to first put the articles into topics. Then I can take 50 million articles and turn them into like 2,500 topics. And those topics, I can learn things about those topics. So again, a topic might be the Benghazi scandal, the presidential primaries, a tornado, a particular tornado, a school shooting. And so each of those is a topic. And then I can ask crowdsourcers, for example, is this a political topic? And then if it's a political topic, I can then invest further resources in finding out whether individual articles are biased. But if it's not a political topic, I'm not going to waste my money having humans judge whether a tornado was biased, liberal, or conservative. And that's going to allow me to basically say things about a lot of different articles without investing as much money and without having as much error. So I'm also going to use some predictive modeling as well. But this combination, this idea of first putting things into what the topic is and then learning about them is something that was an innovation here. So here are just some. This is data from a particular couple of weeks I think 2013, and we had a bunch of different topics like the murder of Travis Alexander, school shootings, death and funeral of Margaret Thatcher. These were the things going on at the time. So what we did first is we said, okay, so here we're going to have red is the percentage coming from direct navigation, and blue is social media. And this doesn't look like it's showing up super well on this slide, so apologies for that. So this chart is going to look at how people do differently when they come from social media versus direct navigation. And down here I have different super topics, I call them, categories. This is crime, politics, and so on. And so for example, I see that people read about more crime from social media. But then what I do is I do an adjustment. I adjust for the user mix, the fact that the people reading are different on social media. And so when I do a control for who the user is, then I see that that's going to actually account for it. And the fact that people read more crime on social media is mostly due to the fact that it's different users on social media rather than the same users doing different things. So I look at a couple of different types of hypotheses. A few things that pop out. Articles that are written from an individual perspective have a bigger blue bar. So a bigger blue bar, bigger blue than green, basically means that we're going to see more of this on social media. More individual perspectives, more articles that assume background knowledge from social media, more that have in-depth analysis, more socially controversial, controversial and one-sided, opinion, politically controversial, or caring and supportive. These are the things that people read more from social media than they do when they go to direct navigation. Let me skip over and then come to my last point, which is political bias. So I want to caution that here, this is a pretty small sample, and so we went back and did reason we haven't released the paper yet is we want to correct these numbers using like an 8-month sample rather than a couple of week sample for this particular number. So these numbers are a little bit overstated, we think, because of the small sample bias. But what we look at is, do people read more liberal, neutral, or conservative articles from social media versus direct navigation? And when we look at all people, we see indeed there's less neutral reading from social media. That is saying that, you know, even like Fox or the New York Times or whatever, they're supposedly biased, but they're going to have a lot of neutral stories. And relative to social media, you're going to read more neutral stuff when it's curated by the outlets. But then when we look at people who have ever read a conservative story, we find that the conservatives only read almost no liberal stories. They read almost no neutral stories from social media, and they read mostly conservative stories from social media. So if you are a conservative, identified by reading in the past conservatively biased articles, you tend to skew very conservative from social media, while if you are liberal, you tend to skew very liberal from social media. And so this is sort of evidence from the filter bubble, and one of my colleagues in the economics department had previously found evidence against the filter bubble, but he had only looked at domain level browsing. And so by really looking at the details of the article, I'm able to discover a little bit more the impact of social media on browsing. And I think in sort of today's political environment, you know, I think we should be concerned about how people are getting their information. And, you know, given that people are making their decisions often based on, you know, information they read online, which may or may not be true, the declining role of the news outlet as a curator, in some sense, like no matter how biased they were trying to be maybe a little bit more neutral than the kind of stuff that people are reading on social media. So, thanks very much.
Thank you, Susan. We'll take questions for all of our panelists at the end so we can also address some cross-cutting themes. Right now I'd like to introduce Professor Fishkin. James S. Fishkin holds the Janet N. Peck Chair in International Communication at Stanford University, where he is Professor of Communication, Professor of Political Science by courtesy, and Director of the Center for Deliberative Democracy. His work focuses on deliberative democracy and democratic theory in books such as When the People Speak, Deliberation Day, and Democracy and Deliberation. He originated deliberative polling as a method of public consultation in 1988, and he began to apply it in collaboration with Robert Luskin in 1994. It has since spread to projects in 23 countries. Professor Fishkin has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you. Does this work? Good, good. So I've only got 12 minutes, and that was a great presentation, by the way. I've only got 12 minutes, so I'm just going to give you an overview and the basic concept of what we're trying to do, and I will show you some applications. Now it's 24 countries, because we've done Mongolia. So my problem is, what would the people think if they were thinking? And that's really important for democracy. What would they think if they were thinking under good conditions? So defining the good conditions and then answering the question, which people? So we do random sampling. We try to get the best samples we can. We try to engage the people in balanced materials, more balanced than some of the media we just heard described. And we work hard to get the people engaged in competing arguments for policy choices. And we do that with random samples in order to represent what the people would think. So it's very different from the kind of slam-bang, mud wrestling of campaigning. And it's actually quite different from what you get from public opinion polls, because most of the time, most people are not well informed about public policy. There's an old explanation going back to Anthony Downs about that. They're rationally ignorant. If they've got one vote in millions, why should they pay a lot of attention to the complexities of public issues? But if they're in a sample of 300 or 400 and in small group discussions of a dozen or 15 that the sample is divided into, and they engage for 2 or 3 days of discussion or many hours online. We do this virtually online with video. We do it face-to-face with good samples. If they engage for a considerable period of time, get their questions answered, we find that maybe 70% of the time their opinions change significantly. And explaining why their opinions change and what those informed opinions would look like then becomes an input to public policy. So let me just, and this is very different, by the way, if you just convene a meeting of some sort or you get self-selected participation online, you're going to get the people who feel strongly or who are mobilized in some way. So if we go to them rather than they going to us and we have a good random sample, then I'm going to skip through this stuff. So we've done this now in 24 countries. And notice we've done this not only in developed countries, we've done this throughout Western Europe, the US, Latin America, Japan, but we've also done it in Uganda and Ghana and Tanzania, and I'm about to go to Senegal. And in these places, too, the people can deliberate, and they offer very coherent reasons for public policy choices affecting their communities. I'll try to get to that. I thought I invented this idea, but of course I didn't. It actually goes back to the ancient Athenians, who, now that's a picture that I snapped in the museum in Athens of the Claroterion, which is the random sampling machine that the Athenians used to select the Council of 500, which met and determined the agenda for voting in the assembly. And then they used this same machine later to select legislative commissions who would have to vote approval for a law that passed the assembly, because they were worried that the orators in the assembly would rile up the people with emotions and mobs and get them into bad situations like the war with Sparta, which they lost. And so they then decided that they would take a random sample who would have to hear the case for and against a new law before it could become a law. And the random sample of 500 would hear it and then vote. And it was all based upon a random sample microcosm rather than the angry mob in the crowd. Because if you have 6,000 people in the assembly, then they can be aroused by the orators. So we're even doing this in China. In fact, I'm just about later today to fly to Singapore because we have a conference about all the deliberative polling all over Asia, in Japan, China, Mongolia, South Korea, and various other places. But that was the first one in China where it's being used for decisions at the local level about budget and infrastructure, and where it offers a form, I think a very advanced form of democracy in a society without elections except at the village level, without party competition, but where the local party leader thought that his citizens, and this is in the Zegwa Township, which has a couple 100,000 people, he thought that they would want, of 30 infrastructure projects, that they would want the image projects, which showed how fast they were developing. In fact, he was very surprised. What they wanted was the sewage treatment plants, the clean water, the environmental plan, and various other things, which then were provided based upon the results of the deliberative poll. And this particular town has been making its budget with deliberative polling ever since 2005, every year. And this is now spreading around China, and it has been blessed at the 18th Party Congress. And this is the Parliament building of the European Union, where this is a sample of the entire European Union selected by a TNS, who do the Eurobarometer, brought to the European Parliament, that's our sample, deliberating about issues affecting Europe. And they had to do it in 22 languages with simultaneous translation. We have some papers about this. It worked beautifully. We put all of Europe in one room where it could deliberate. Europe has a parliament, but the discussion in Europe is the French talk to the French, the Germans to the Germans, the Bulgarians to the Bulgarians. Well, can they all talk to each other and make policy? And we did this again, by the way, on two very hot topics, climate change and immigration. We got very interesting, constructive results. So we've done this twice. So, as you know, you don't need a larger sample for a larger population, which is why we can do this in Europe. We've done it nationally in the US with a PBS partner, but let me go on. In Texas, very interestingly, we did 8 projects with the Public Utility Commission about how to provide energy. And it turned out that the public was willing to pay a bit more on its energy bills to support wind power and also to support conservation. And so the Public Utility Commission added 25 cents to the bills of all these millions of customers, and that allowed Texas to move from 1996 to 2007. It went from number 50 out of the 50 states, that is last in wind power, to number 1, surpassing California in 2007, largely based upon our data and the integrated resource plans that were filed with our data. So people were, this is an interesting one. In Ghana, by the way, this is a tremendously high response rate, random sample of households, random selection in the households. And in Ghana, the issues were about water, sanitation, hygiene, food security. This is a city of 500,000 people in the north, the poorest part of Ghana. This is with USAID support. And so it was a really good sample. And 29 of the proposals changed, out of 39. I didn't have, there's no, I wanted to show you that people were really, deliberation involves people weighing competing arguments. I thought I had this map, but it's not in this slide presentation. There's a map of the, all of the public toilets in the city of Tamale and all of the vegetable gardens. And because only a very small percentage of the sample has toilets in their own dwellings. And the two maps are identical. Wherever there's a public toilet, there's a vegetable garden. The challenge that people were weighing was really a challenge between disease on the one hand and food security on the other. And there was a big movement in favor of completely banning the use of untreated wastewater for agriculture, but also support for filtering the wastewater through charcoal and stones, which is cheap. Also, other sources of water like rainwater harvesting, because this part of Ghana is very dry most of the year, but there's a certain period of rain. So those things are being implemented. How much more time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. This is another very interesting case. This is in Japan. This was a national project. And Japan was thinking of privatizing its pension system at the time that we did this. And their support for privatizing the pension system, which the government, this is the DPJ government at the time, was somewhat misleadingly calling the funded system, because if you have privatized pension system, everybody's got their own account, so it's funded. And we have a Japanese partner at Keio University who have their own center for DP, DP meaning deliberative polling. And we did a national sample in Japan, and support for the funded system fell from 69 to 35% with deliberation. Japan, as you may know, they're very concerned about privacy. It's even very difficult to do telephone polling in Japan. And they did not have an adequate way of keeping track of the contributions to the Social Security or pension system that individuals are making. So if they were going to add taxes, they needed a tax that they could know everybody was paying without an invasion of privacy. There was such a tax, the consumption tax, which was very low at the time. So the DPJ government proposed raising based upon not just consonant with our results, there are many factors, but consonant with our results, the DPJ government proposed raising the consumption tax and abandoning its apparent plan to do the privatization of the pension system. And the LDP government, when they came in, confirmed the rise in the consumption tax. So if they had stuck with the privatization, people didn't want the risk. Because we do qualitative as well as quantitative analysis. We have all these discussions. We tape the discussions. The Japanese people didn't really want the risk of putting their pensions in the stock market when they thought about it. But when they just heard about it as a soundbite, it sounded like a good idea. Bulgaria, with the Roma, we did the desegregation of the Roma-only schools are now actually desegregated. That's a long story. Here's Mongolia, which is a most recent project. This is the government palace in Mongolia, where we did for the city of Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital city, has half the population. Oh, you can see that must be summer. We did ours in December, which is the coldest city in the coldest capital city in the world. Well, I didn't have any results. One of the things about Ulaanbaatar is again, just like the Chinese party leader who thought his people would want the image projects and wasn't really in touch with what the public really would want. The mayor in Ulaanbaatar, who's a great Democrat, he thought the people would want. There were 30-some projects that were being evaluated. These were, no, not quite 30. These were the projects in the master plan that were very expensive, that would require borrowing, that had been worked on for years. And he thought the best project was probably a metro system, which the Japanese were offering to lend the money for. However, what the public really wanted, since it's so incredibly cold in Mongolia, what they really wanted was proper heating and insulation in the schools, because the kids were freezing. And given the commodity prices recently, the economy is a little bit fragile, so the public hesitated to take on that much debt. So the metro actually went to the bottom, and the heating and insulation of the schools went to the top. So the mayor has already issued a directive saying that of the projects in the master plan, they will be implemented in accordance with the public specification in the deliberative poll. And we're now about to do another deliberative poll to put this in the city charter, the capacity to do this over and over. I can't talk about this internet access one because this was in a way, exactly the opposite of most of the deliberative polls. This was a population of the internet experts of the world in the Internet Governance Forum. And people said, oh, these people are too educated to deliberate, and they're experts, so they won't learn anything and they won't change. They changed significantly about proposals to bring access to the next billion people. We did this in João Pessoa, Brazil, in December. And I like to pair this to the Ghana thing that I presented to you, because people said, you can't do deliberative democracy in Africa because the people aren't educated. In fact, we had to have a video version of the briefing materials in Ghana because many of the people couldn't read the materials, the background materials. And in Ghana and Uganda, Tanzania, it worked great. And with the experts, too, the experts demonstrably learned and they changed their views. And so it works at both ends. So this is a research program. I can't go into the detail about specific. This is a research program about getting the public will. It's not exactly crowdsourcing, but you could say it's the wisdom of the crowd. But it's a way of getting the wisdom of the crowd with a representative sample rather than a self-selected sample, when people have really had a chance to think rather than just giving an immediate top-of-the-head reaction. And where we can investigate the reasons for their changes, both quantitatively, we can do regressions on which are the factors that are leading to the opinion changes, but also qualitatively, we can take all the transcripts of the discussions and go in considerable depth. And the one thing I've learned from this whole research program around the world is the public, if you engage it in the right conditions, is very smart. it only appears stupid when under other conditions everybody's trying to mislead them, bamboozle them, and they don't think their voice matters. But if you can convince people that their voice matters under conditions where they can actually get the information and have a civil, mutually respectful conversation with other people, so which is why we always have moderated small groups, it's amazing what you can learn from the public. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Our next panelist has a treat for you in the form of a demo, actually, of some of his work. And while he's setting up, I'll introduce Ashish Goel is a professor of management science and engineering and, by courtesy, computer science at Stanford and a member of Stanford's Institute for Computational and Mathematical Engineering. He received his PhD in computer science from Stanford in 1999 and was an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Southern California from 1999 to 2002. His research interests lie in the design, analysis, and applications of algorithms. Current application areas of interest include social networks, participatory democracy, internet commerce, and large-scale data processing. Professor Goel is a recipient of an Alfred P. Sloan Faculty Fellowship, a Terman Faculty Fellowship from Stanford, an NSF Career Award, and a Rajiv Motwani Mentorship Award. He was a co-author on the paper that won the Best Paper at WWW 2009 and an Edelman Laureate in 2014. Professor Goel was a research fellow and technical advisor at Twitter from July 2009 to August 2014 and loves to talk about it.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about this problem that we broadly call decision-making at scale. Okay? And we're trying to come at this from a fairly engineering angle. So here's the basic problem, right? It's very much aligned with what Jim just described. In fact, Jim's work has been a big inspiration for us over the last several years. So the question is, in participatory democracy, what you would like is that instead of making decisions in a council, you would like to make decisions with the people, right? So you would like to have a lot of individuals participating in making decisions directly. Okay? And a simple example of decision making at scale is you go to the ballot box and you say, who's going to be the president, Obama or Romney? And those kinds of polls are easy to conduct. But imagine instead you want to have a poll, you want to have a direct poll, right? A direct democracy poll, where the actual outcome is going to be implemented. And the question you're going to ask is, how can we cut the US budget deficit? Now, I can guarantee you go to any website, right? Any website, and you pose this question on that website, and you see the responses you get. You might get like one or two questions, one or two responses which are sort of considered, like increased taxes or something, right? And rest of them, someone is going to call someone a communist, someone is going to bring up death panels, and the whole thing is going to degrade from there, right? So the question is, how can we make decisions at scale in the face of polarization and extreme opinions? Okay? We don't want to remove polarization. We don't even want to study polarization, right? So polarization exists. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. What we want to focus on is, can we still make decisions? Free-form discussion boards often degenerate into vitriol, and so we need more structured modes of interaction with provable properties. So one way of thinking about our long-term research agenda, which we may or may not achieve, is that YouTube is in this relationship with the entertainment industry, where YouTube is both a supplement and a complement. You can use YouTube to replace entertainment, movie watching, but you can also, movie makers can also use YouTube as a distribution mechanism. They can also use it to get their trailers out. We saw this example beautifully in Susan's talk, where you could say Google's news was both in competition and in synergy, right? Coursera does the same, and Twitter does the same thing for the news media. Coursera does the same thing for education. It's in competition as well as collaboration with the universities, right? What's the equivalent for Washington? And as you think about it, there's no equivalence, right? The way we make decisions is still substantially the same. And what we would like to understand is, what kind of systems would we need to build if we actually wanted to make decisions at scale, not just conversations or discussion, but actual decisions. So our high-level design goals are to come up with provably good mechanisms. We want mathematical models, and the broad space that you're looking at is that the number of candidates is the number of voters. So imagine you're running a voting scheme where everyone has an idea, right? Every voter has a proposal, so the number of candidates would be the same as the number of voters. No voter can even look at all the candidates when the number of candidates is that large. And so what we need are small group interactions, limit the cognitive load on individuals. We need not just voting, but also collaboration and discussion. And some of the things that we want to do when we say mathematical models, provably good mechanisms, what does it mean to have provably good mechanisms? We need to align people's incentives, right? And formally show the incentives are aligned. We need to promote fairness. We need to formally be able to claim that we recognize minority opinion in some way. We need to be able to support unstructured decision spaces. And this whole this whole program is too hard to illustrate. It may also be too hard to achieve, but I'm going to illustrate small examples of this in today's talk. I'm going to show an example of aligning incentives, recognizing minority opinions, supporting unstructured decision spaces. Some of these are going to be very, very practical and on the ground. Some of them are going to be more mathematical models. So one of the things that's more practical is participatory budgeting. There's a US-wide push for participatory budgeting now. There have been multiple workshops at the White House on this topic. And so the way this participatory budgeting exercise gets currently conducted is via K approval voting. A set of proposed spending projects get put to the ballot for residents directly. Every voter chooses K projects for a fixed K, and the projects that get the most vote get implemented subject to a budget cap. And so we have a small digital voting platform. So this entire process is very complex. It involves first people coming together, deciding that they want to do it, then forming a steering committee, then having some way of evaluating projects that get put on the ballot. What I'm going to show is just a voting platform. Once you have done all that, how do you actually vote on which projects get chosen? Okay? This platform has been used in over 24 elections, like Chicago, New York City, Long Beach, many others. So I have slides illustrating this, but since I also have good Wi-Fi, being at Stanford, I'd rather do a demo. So this is an example. So these are all the places where we had these elections so far. The ones which are active and the ones which are inactive are the ones which have concluded. This is what a basic interface looks like. Okay? So you choose the projects you want to support by clicking on the select button. It's a fairly simple interface. And so one thing that immediately comes to mind when you have voting interfaces, digital voting interfaces of this type, is are we creating a literacy divide or a digital divide? And our claim is that we are actually helping bridge the literacy divide. So it's a digital bridge, not a digital divide. So look at something like the street alley resurfacing and sidewalk repairs, and just look at the amount of text there. Right? And imagine someone actually looking at a ballot box and trying to understand all that text. But it gets worse. In the actual paper ballot box, you would actually have a description, a physical description of what's going to happen if you allocate 100K, 200K, 300K for each. For each of them, there's a list of streets that would get repaved. Okay? So this is a small election that happens in Chicago's 49th ward. The alderman puts aside $1 million, and people decide how to spend those $1 million. On a digital platform, if you click 60%, you can immediately see on a map which streets are going to get repaved. Right? So there's some advantage to using a digital platform. If you want to select more trees in Rogers Park, you can see on a map where Rogers Park is. Right? And then you just go ahead and you submit your vote. And so the platform that I showed you has many features. You can authenticate in various ways. It's got analytics, but it's not really, I wouldn't call it innovative. Right? It's just like a straight platform. And there's several problems with this way of voting. So what are some of the problems if we were to vote? So first of all, this K approval voting has, as far as we think, like it's got three major problems, and the first one is the biggest one. In K approval voting, where you go and select the K things you want implemented, there's no recognition of trade-offs. So in our mind, it's a wrong question to ask, is it better to build a fountain in a park or to fill a pothole on a street? Because that question doesn't make the trade-offs in the problem transparent. And we believe that if you're going to have direct decision-making at scale, then the people who are making these direct decisions have to work under the same constraints as faced by the decision maker. So one way of making them transparent is to ask the following question: is it better to build a fountain for $10,000 or fill a pothole for $1,000? Right? You have to somehow have the cost be a part of the decision-making process. Otherwise, it becomes like a beauty contest, right? And so this is sort of the big high-level design goal, that if you have direct decision-making, you need to have a recognition of the trade-offs. And then in K approval voting, and this is more technical, there are strange incentives. There exist cases where a voter should vote for A if he's being strategic, even if he prefers B and B is winning. Just like you go to a horse race, there's a horse that's your sentimental favorite. You can look in the future, you know that horse is going to win, but you'll bet on some other horse, right? And that sounds bizarre, but that can happen with K approval voting. And then aggregation. What's the rationale for choosing projects? People chose these K projects in something which looked like a beauty contest, right? And they weren't taking cost into account. How do you then choose which projects to actually implement? Right? So there's a problem in algorithms or computer science called the knapsack problem. Okay? And the knapsack problem is the following. Right? You actually have a knapsack, and this knapsack has a certain capacity, and there are a bunch of things that you can actually pack into this knapsack. Right? I could pack this laptop, I could pack other things. Each of them has a weight or a size and a value. I want to pack as much value as possible into my knapsack. So one thing that we recognized when we started to look at these budgeting problems is that every budgeting problem is a knapsack problem. You're given a certain amount of budget, you want to pack as much societal utility into this amount as possible. So for example, there might be a project which costs 300K and has utility 70, another one costs 250K and has utility 60, and you want to somehow pack all of these into the knapsack, and that's the right abstraction to think of how you would vote on these problems. Can someone point out some difficulty with this picture? Like this project costs 300K and utility 70, and you want to pack as many projects into your budget as possible to maximize utility. I mean, where does this utility come from? How do I know that the utility of a project is 70, right? We are not used to expressing the utility of things quantitatively. If I ask you, for example, in Jim's example, if I ask somebody, what's the utility to you of having more toilets, right? They wouldn't know. I mean, who knows? This is like 700, is it 800, in what unit, right? Plus, different people would have different utilities, right? So how would you aggregate them? Right? So as it turns out, this problem actually turns out to be easier than we thought. Okay? And the simple solution for this problem is to just ask people to solve the knapsack problem. So instead of asking people to report their utility, you can give every individual the choice of solving the knapsack problem themselves. Right? So it's a fairly simple thing. This is a process that we ran in Boston for a nonprofit. It was an internal process, not a citywide process. And there they could select something. So you select Facebook ads. They want to figure out how much to advertise. You can move a bar saying how much money you want to make. And on top, there's a knapsack, which is getting filled. And once the knapsack is filled, you're out of luck, right? There's no more money left. And then you have to go and remove something. And this really mimics the decision-making process. You can get a solution to the knapsack problem from everybody, okay, without them having to articulate what their individual utilities are. Okay? And this is the kind of process that even though people can't articulate what the utility of everything is, it's hard for someone to say in some numeraire, we don't know what numeraire, what's the utility of having these t-shirts? Nobody knows, right? But they can still solve this knapsack problem, and then the question then becomes, how do you aggregate them? Okay? So once you have this interface for solving the knapsack problem, the natural question is, how do you aggregate them? And so we have some complicated way of aggregating, but it boils down to the following thing. Okay? You imagine that each project is broken down into many sub-projects of $1 each. Okay? So if someone votes $700 for t-shirts, they're putting down a vote for the first dollar for a t-shirt, the second dollar for the t-shirt, the third dollar for the t-shirt. They're putting down 700 votes in total. And you just calculate the total number of votes for each dollar sub-project of every project. And then you pick the B sub-projects where B is your budget that get the most votes. Okay? And this is something which turns out to be easy to explain. We have managed to explain it to multiple cities. For the first time, this knapsack voting process is actually being used in an actual large-scale participatory budgeting. It's actually happening this week in the Boston Public School District. And it's also fairly easy to explain to them visually what this looks like. So for example, you can actually take the votes that people cast for every project. You can actually lay them out as saying how many votes are being made at every dollar level. You can look at the projects which get the most votes. So it turns out to be, I know it's going to be very hard to sort of visualize all this in a short talk, but it's been fairly easy for us to show people, to convince cities that it's sort of knapsack voting is worth doing. It can actually be aggregated. People don't have a hard time understanding it. And plus, we can prove interesting theorems about it. So, for example, first of all, we fulfill our basic need, which is we wanted to make voters recognize trade-offs. And for now, let's assume with a loss of generality that all projects cost the same. And in that case, the aggregation method is to choose the projects to get the most votes. Okay? This is without loss of generality, but I'm not going to prove that it's without loss of generality. And so we define this notion of utility called the overlap utility, which says if a voter wants allocation X for a budget item, and the final chosen budget has an allocation Y for that item, then the voter's utility for that item is the min of X comma Y. Okay? So I wanted $1 million to go for paving a street. 900K got allocated, so my utility is 900K. If I wanted $1 million, 2 million got allocated, my utility is still $1 million. So my utility is the min of what got allocated and what I wanted. Okay, that's called the overlap utility. In other words, how much I like a budget depends on how much it overlaps with my ideal budget. Okay? And under that situation, we can show that this is strategy proof. So a voter cannot increase a utility by misreporting a preferred budget, regardless of how others vote. Okay? And in this particular case, truth telling is the dominant strategy. So once again, these things like strategy proofness are directional. Okay? these are sort of complex problems with many, many different, there's a steering committee, there's a city, there's a mayor, right? And something like strategy proofness is not the sole method for determining which election to implement, but it's an important direction. And then, so I think I'm out of time, so I'm not going to get to the other two, but I'm glad I illustrated one as opposed to sort of do a bad job of illustrating 3 things. Once we have this, once we know that knapsack voting is good, you can make even simpler interfaces for knapsack voting. So for example, for those of you who have taken an algorithms class, the optimum solution to the knapsack problem is to choose projects in decreasing order of value for money. So instead of asking people to solve a full knapsack, if you ask them to just arrange projects in decreasing order of value for money, they can you can still solve the knapsack problem optimally. And this is something that people are very used to doing. So for example, we have this interface where we show people, and this has not actually been, this is just an experiment. It's not actually been part of a real election. But as an experiment, it works very well. You show people which project is the best value for money, okay, or the most benefit to the community per dollar spent. And people find this question very easy to answer. Because if you ask me what's the utility of buying a BMW, I don't know. If you say what's the utility of sending my daughter to a private school, I don't know. But every day people make decisions like, is it better value for money to buy a BMW or to sell your daughter to a private school? Right? Even though these things are very different and they cost very different amounts. So once people can tell you which project is the best value for money, if you could aggregate them into a consistent ranking, you can use that to solve the knapsack problem. So I think I'm out of time. I'm going to stop. Thank you.